A very good morning to you students. Today I am here to carry on with the chapter Politics of Planned Development from the book Politics in India Since Independence. So in the previous videos of the same chapter, we discussed that how the Planning Commission started with its work and its execution with the first and the second 5-year plans. Before I left, I told you that in this video we'll be talking on terms like the primary and the secondary sector and differentiation between them, public and private sector, and how the government's role will be discussed by the critics all over the country. My India, my pride, as it is rightly said. So here we are about to begin with the session wherein we will see that when the government launched its first 5-year plan with the agro-based target in mind, then how it was dealt, and when the second 5-year plans were executed with an industrial base, then how the people and the critics took it. So before we actually go on to the slide work, I'll tell you that when you talk about the sectors of economy, the sectors of economy are divided into 3. The primary sector, which is mainly agro-based, the secondary sector, which is industrial-based, and the tertiary sector, which talks about the services like telecommunication, transport, tourism, etc. So herein we are tackling only with the primary and the secondary sector. Why? Because our main concern was to talk on the differentiation between the first and the second 5-year plans. Just a review of what we have done, a rapid recap of what we have already done. When we talked on terms of first 5-year plan, then it was a success. The pace was rather slow, but somehow it achieved success. Why? Because it had an agricultural base. Our country is agro-based, and that is why the main concern of the government was to provide irrigation and the dam construction so that it can go on well. So herein when you talk on the primary and the secondary sector, a very simple definition of it would be that the primary sector is that sector of the economy which talks on the direct use of natural resources like agriculture, fishing, mining, forestry. Whereas when you talk about the secondary sector of the economy, the secondary sector is that sector of the economy which secondary manufacturing of the raw material is dealt with, or which deals in with the secondary processing of the raw materials like some textile, some food manufacturing, etc. Going on to the slides. Between agriculture and industry, which one should attract more public resources in a backward economy like India? We need to remember that when we initiated the first and the second 5-year plan, then India was a developing country. Its economy was backward. It was engulfed with the, you can say, sickness of poverty. The youth was unemployed, and there were lots of social disturbances in the country. The second plan lacked an agrarian base. Why? Because it boosted with the industries. It wanted to give more focus to the industrial sector. It wanted the youth to join the industries in order to get job opportunities, as well as to take out some rural population and migrate it into the urban areas. The emphasis on industry caused agriculture and rural India to suffer. Chaudhry Charan Singh, a Congress leader, who later broke from the party to form the Bharatiya Lok Dal, forcefully argued that the case for keeping agriculture at the center planning for India will always be useful. Moving on to the next slide. He said that planning was leading to creation of prosperity in the urban and the industrial section at the expense of farmers and the rural population. They argued that Indian planning did have an agrarian society and base, but it was about the production of food grains only. The state made laws for land reforms, distribution of resources among the poor in the villages. This failure was not that of the policy, but its non-implementation because the land owning classes had a lot of social and political power. I would like you to go back to the previous video here at this point, wherein I discussed that the major problem that was coming in front of the government was the distribution of land in India. The distribution of land had a very tough procedure, and mainly the role of the landlords, which acted like gods in front of the rural population, was another problem. And that is why laws were made, but its implementation was a problem. As we often say that in India, rules are made to be broken. So it is not that the laws and the rules are not made, but the main problem lies in its execution. They also argue that even if the government had spent more money on agriculture, it would not have solved the massive problem of rural poverty. So the critics had a lot of things to say. One, that it gave emphasis to the urban lot. Another, that agricultural maybe target that the first 5-year plan had did not solve the problem of poverty, and so on. Moving on to the next slide. Public versus private sector. So herein, students, when we talk about the role of the government, because now when we discuss the first and the second 5-year plan, then the role of the government was at stake. People could not decide that the government should interfere in its process of making laws and functioning of the country or not. And if the role of the government is at stake, then to which extent? And that is why there was a question among the critics that which sector should get emphasis, public or private. Now we need to remember that when we talk about the public sector, we are mainly talking about the government's role. Whereas when we talk about the private sector, that is the sector which includes business by the individuals, where their goal is profit making. Whereas when you talk about the government's role, its role is to give most and the major of the you can say facilities to the people. It is not bothered about the profit making. India did not follow any of the two known paths of development. It did not accept the capitalist mode of development, in which development was left entirely to the private sector, and it did not follow the socialist mode, where the private property was abolished and all the production was controlled by the state. We need to remember that a mixed model of development was initiated by the government. Why? Because India is a country where there is a lot of diversity in every sphere. It is not having a presidential form of government, wherein the president acts like a dictator to the people. We follow democracy, and our target is to follow democracy side by side the development. So development and democracy go side by side simultaneously in our country, and that is why a mixed model of development was initiated, so that there are some services which are entirely controlled by the government, whereas there are few works which can be given to the private individuals, like the businessmen, business tycoons, big entrepreneurs, etc. Bureaucrats even, and the politicians and the leaders even, which carry on with their individual business. Now, before I go on to the reading of this slide, I would like to tell you that in this concept, in class 11th also, you must have studied that for this particular part, there were the construction of 3 lists: the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. The union list had those subjects which were of prime concern, like military. The state list had subjects which were of the concern of the state, and whereas the third list, that is the tertiary list, had or the concurrent list had those subjects wherein the state can take an action, but in case of a fix, in case of a problem, in case the judgment of the state made by the state is not applicable to the people, or the people are not satisfied with its judgment, at that time the center government can intervene. So herein we are talking about a mixed model of development, wherein there are certain areas which were guaranteed to the central government, where the government can intervene, whereas there are subjects on which the state can decide on its own. There are some works which are given to the government to intervene, whereas there are some works and services which are left to the private sector. Elements from both these models were taken, that is, not entirely the work given to the private individuals and not entirely the government's work to take care of everything happening in the country. A mixed together in India, that is why it was described as a mixed economy. Much of the agriculture, trade and industry were left in private hands. The state controlled key heavy industries like iron and steel, provided industrial infrastructure, regulated trade and made some crucial interventions in agriculture. So wherever there was a major role to be played, a vital key role to be played, at that time the state intervened. Other things were left for the private ownership. Moving on to the next slide. Mixed model like this was open to criticism both from the left and the right. You know, any new thing that comes up invites a criticism free of cost. So whenever there is a revolution, whenever there is a change, there are people who criticize it. And similarly, it happened in our country also, when our country, unlike other countries, adopted a mixed economy, which was not like dealt with any other country. Then there was a lot of criticism from the left and the right wings. Created enough hurdles for the private capital, especially by way of installing systems of license and permits for investment. The state's policy to restrict import of goods that could be produced in the domestic market with little or no competition left the private sector with no incentive to improve their products and make them cheaper. We live in a global market. I'm not talking about the recent global market, but when at that time, after independence, India had shaken hands well with other countries. Then there was an exchange of goods and services. At that time, the domestic businessmen suffered heavy losses. Why? Because there was a you can say a neck-to-neck competition for products, and that is why they were left with no other means but to cheaper their cost. Then there were critics who thought that the state did not do enough. They pointed out that the state did not spend any significant amount for public education and healthcare. So for public education and healthcare, there was a criticism that the state should have spent a little more. Why? Because if you remember the Kerala model that we had discussed in the last slide, then they gave a lot of importance to healthcare, medication and education, because they believe that a healthy mind resides in a healthy body. Health is wealth, and that is why there were critics in India who criticized the government for not raising enough funds for like rooms like education and public health. So we'll see that what is like a rapid review of what we have done today. Before I go to the last slide, till now we have discussed the differentiation between the agricultural and the industrial sector, that is the primary and the secondary sector. Nevertheless, to remember, economy can be divided into three sectors, but right now we are differentiating between agriculture and industrial sector, because our goal is to talk in terms of the first 5-year plan, which targeted on agriculture, and the second 5-year plan, which wanted to raise industries. Then we had a discussion on the public and the private sector, that is the role of government and how far it can intervene in the affairs of the people. So we discussed that India did not adopt a totally government's role in the public means, nor everything to be given to the private individuals, but it adopted a mixed economy, and that is why it is called as a mixed development economy, because we have given a few shares to the government to intervene the subjects of prime importance like heavy industries like iron and steel, and subjects of prime importance like military, and whereas there are things which are given to the private ownership also. Moving on to the last but not the least slide of our video today. The state intervened only in those areas where the private sector was not prepared to go. Thus the state helped the private sector to make profit. Instead of helping the poor, we need to remember that the goal, the target of a private sector is only profit, whereas a government's target is to provide the maximum benefit to the people. And that is why I said that the government did not intervene in the areas wherein it thought that the private individuals can make profit. Instead of helping the poor, the state intervention ended up in creating a new middle class that enjoyed high salary, privileges of high salary, that is good perks, but without much accountability. They were not accountable to the government, but at the same time they were enjoying good perks, handsome salary and all facilities. So for this was the end of the two main topics of the chapter, that is agriculture versus industries and private versus public sector. In the next video of the same chapter, we'll be discussing few more topics and we'll end up this chapter, and then we'll be talking on terms of notes, picture compositions, caricatures and other things. Till then, stay tuned, stay safe. Thank you so much.